thanks to all the mud we had tracked in, the brick floor was bumpy and uneven. If it had been me down there, I can imagine how uncomfortable it would have been. But no one was as uncomfortable as Zhang. Our classmates' discomfort was physical. Our teachers' was mental. Punishing someone by hurting yourself is nothing to be proud of and is considered rather thuggish behavior. But anyone capable of doing it, in my opinion, is no run-of-the-mill thug. There is a heroic side to the behavior of a thug and a thuggish side to the behavior of a hero. So was He Zivu a big-time thug or a big-time hero? Don't ask me.
Naveen has published two of Mo Yan's books, and Mo Yan, as you know, has recently been awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. Naveen, welcome to the show today.
Thank you, Urvashi.
Tell us a little bit about it.
Well, this is the book that supposedly changes the life of independent publishers. This was a little memoir, part fiction, part autobiography, written by Mo Yan, commissioned by us in 2009 as part of a series of books we did to kind of commemorate the fall of the Berlin Wall, the 20th anniversary, because it was felt that the rest of the world will be celebrating the sort of death of communism. And we wanted to go back to these countries and revisit what we thought was a kind of what happened to this lost Atlantis, this great dream project. And well, it's a long story, but that's precisely what Mo Yan set out to do in this tiny little book.
So, but how did you, a publisher placed in Calcutta, come to know about Mo Yan's work, come to publish it? Because of course the excitement at this year's Frankfurt Book Fair was great when it was learnt that there was an Indian publisher who held the rights to the world rights to the Nobel Prize winning author. How did you encounter him? Where did you find him?
First of all, it's a complete, you know, with the rest of whatever we do, it's been a series of accidents. In 2005, I happened to be in London, and our dear mutual friend and author Mahashweta Devi was invited to Udine in Italy.
In Italy.
And she was getting what is a major prize in Italy called the Nonino Prize for Literature, which was set up by the Nonino family. And once a year
who make grappa.
That's right, who make grappa. So this is their great promotional thing. And they usually give it to one Italian and two foreigners.
Okay.
Mo Yan and Mahashweta were chosen that year. I was going there to do a little hand-holding for Mahashweta Di. And on the way back from this event, Mo Yan, his daughter Xiao Xiao, who speaks English. Mo Yan, by the way, doesn't speak a word of English. And I traveled by road to Venice. And we went to spend one day together, courtesy our hosts in Udine. Canals, a lovely hotel, conversation with the writer, but through the daughter. I, as you know, do black and white photography, so I did a few portraits of him on the canal and that kind of thing. And that was it. I mean, I remembered him as somebody I had read. I had seen his, well, everybody's seen his Red Shorgum. And so it was interesting to meet this man, spend a few days, and then this sort of thing together as a day. Then we jumped to 2009 when we were doing this series called What Was Communism. So I did prints of these pictures and I sent it to him, reminding him that this is how we'd met, this is who I was, and may I please request you to write a 30,000, 25,000 word piece. And I gave him the theme of what this was about. We wanted, it was complete freedom. You had somebody from Cuba, somebody from the Balkans, and Tariq Ali was editing this series. So some people wrote fiction, some wrote essays, and he wrote this kind of part fiction, part memoir. Gave it to us. We did this book. That started a relationship of what are you doing next and what are you doing next. And all the letters would go through the daughter. And we managed to get his next book, which was called Pao in Chinese, which we pun and call Pao in English, because Pao sort of loosely means everything from shrapnel and explosion and bomb. So, which his translator, Howard Goldblatt, we contacted because we tend to work with translators who are used to doing that. And that's how this happened. So there wasn't any great mystery to it. There was no, you know, you don't as a publisher set out to nurture Nobel authors. I mean, it's, you look for interesting material, you build a list which, you know, for example, at this particular, when this was announced, we happened to have in the first so-called 21 names that were bandied about by the press, there were 5 or 6 people that we've happened to publish. So it's got really very little to do with me or my foresight. It's a question of my interest in a certain kind of literature, the relationship being built up, and relationship is a word that will occur again and again in our work as publishers. That's how it happened.
That's how it happened. But he's a very interesting writer. I think, I mean, there's not much known about Moyan as a writer in India, I imagine, although I could be wrong, because I don't think many of his books have reached here. But somebody who grew up in a small village, came from a farming family, a peasant family, was thrown out of school and yet kept sneaking back into school because he so loved being there. And then he went off to work in a petroleum factory, had this strange fascination with trucks.
Trucks, yeah, the book is, you know, all about.
Yeah, the trucks appear and reappear in the books, and this truck which almost seems to have a life of its own and is talked to by people as if it's a character. And then he goes and joins the PLA, the Liberation Army, and then he starts writing while he's still there. And the first novel is written at in his early 30s or something like that.
That's right.
Yeah, and then he goes on to teach and so on. So it's quite a fascinating sort of writing career. And had you read much of his work when you actually?
When I first met him, I had just seen the film and read the book. And it was after one met him and before one actually, you know, did this particular book change. I started to find his books. Now that itself was interesting because one of the things that, I mean, now I guess it'll all come out every time he talks to the media, which is that he got published fairly extensively. He was fairly prolific. Arcade were his publishers in America.
You got published extensively in China first and then?
No, China, of course, it's a given that he was being published, but I'm talking the English language world. He got published by Arcade in America, then Arcade ran into trouble. And then he kind of fell off the map, except for people who were interested in Chinese literature. And Red Shorgum too becomes, it's like when you discuss amongst ourselves or we talk to friends, they remember the name and the film, but they wouldn't equate Moyan, you know. So it was much later, I think, that when we picked him up in a certain kind of way, started to publish basically 2 books really, and the other one's just coming out. And then now with the Nobel, there is suddenly an interest in all the older books, as often happens. I don't think a lot of his oeuvres has actually been translated either. There's a lot of stuff in the Chinese language which has been done, which is still to see the light of day.
So you don't think much has been translated out of Chinese into English?
Well, there's been the English, certainly, but there have been other languages. He has been done extensively. Soyo has done 12 books. Hanser has done. There's lots of other languages. He's very well at one level. You know, it's like we used to say about Tarkovsky, a filmmaker's filmmaker. He's very much a writer's writer. And I mean, I always feel that there's many Moyans, you know, in the sense that even communicating through his daughter, it was interesting that he was all there. He's not necessarily communicating with the language. She is very proper and kind of, you know, like, she's like a very young school teacher type person and interpreting, being very courteous about explaining things to him. But it's almost as if he's getting a sense of what I'm saying and answering in a kind of, not quite waiting for it in a certain kind of way. And when you read the man, of course, there is this huge, I mean, there's humor, certainly, as you and I may know it, but there's also very, very, what should we say, there's very subtle ways of being political.
There's a very interesting kind of upturning of characters, upturning of, I mean, for example, he's introducing the Japanese invaders and looking at the invasion of China from their point of view and so on. In the Nobel award, when they talked about him, they describe his writing as something which falls into a sort of category called hallucinatory realism. And he himself says that he's influenced quite largely by Marquez, whose writing for whatever is known as magical realism. What's the sort of difference between these two? Is there a difference?
Sorry.
I think sometimes once you described it as something like a drug-like effect.
Well, I mean, that's a very personal thing which I seem to have about, well, Moyan certainly, but I have this sort of personal criteria for a certain kind of writing that moves me. There's the sort of intellectual exercise that you do, you sort of enjoy the prose, a certain kind of literature. And then there is something for somebody who's a control freak and who will not be out of me, and definitely not into drugs and alcohol in that sort of way. I have this imagined sense of the fact that every bit of writing from people like Moyan is like somebody shoving a needle into your bloodstream, and you kind of don't actually have control. You're reading the stuff and it's reading you, and you're kind of, there's a sense that the author is writing his characters and the characters are writing the author, and it's a kind of thing where anything is possible. In that sense, hallucinatory, in that sense, magical. That, magic as in a lay person's understanding of it, not necessarily magic as in literary terms,
Let's talk a little bit, Naveen, about our own Nobel Prize winner, Rabindranath Tagore, all those many years ago, who won the Nobel also for literature, but for a very different kind of writing from, say, Moyan. Very poetic, very descriptive, evocative, sometimes very personal, quite reflective, all of those sorts of things. Not writing that was necessarily outwardly political. I mean, Moyan's is not either, but politics is somewhere simmering underneath all the time.
Even though Tagore was in a political situation, did write a lot of political stuff, and whether it's the nationalism stuff or... So
and also took a lot of took a lot of political stances. But I mean, for the Nobel, the writing that was considered was much more his, within quotes, purely literary writing, if one can actually talk about that. What struck me about the Tagore's time was that much of his writing was made available to the world outside of India and outside of Bengal through translation, and a lot of it through English translation, and almost the entire oeuvre was translated by Western publishers. Because at the time,
lots of Macmillan type stuff.
Macmillan and so on. At the time, I suppose that there weren't the possibilities of publishing those kinds of things within India in English, although they did appear in Indian languages. Today, you as a publisher, for example, are placed in a very different kind of situation, placed in Calcutta, acting as an international publisher, publishing for the entire world from that location, and finding your authors in gondolas in Venice, as opposed to going to publisher parties and locating authors or whatever. So what you want to talk a little bit about your model of publishing and what Seagull is trying to do?
Yeah, sure. We as you know, we started life as theatre publishers and fine art and film and so on and so forth for the first 24 years of our 30-year life. Sometime in 2005, it was one of those things where we felt that a lot of the major conglomerates from America and UK, the names, they were all settling down because India is such a vast English-speaking market. So everyone was in New Delhi, and this was a reality. So partly tongue-in-cheek, and partly when we articulated for ourselves the way we understood being what we are as publishers and independent in a globalized situation, we said to ourselves, what if we reversed this? What if we were in London and New York? What if our money was as good as everybody else's? Our design and production quality is of a certain standard. Why shouldn't we be allowed to publish Picasso or Jean-Paul Sartre or Toni Morrison or whatever? And like everything else, we at Seagull, we decided that let's try and explore the logistics of how to do this. And one of the things, a parameter we set ourselves was that we would not want to exist in these countries as anything other than an independent, tax-paying, legal, incorporated entity. We didn't want architectural realities and office spaces. We didn't want staff infrastructure, because the idea was that in a globalized world today, you and I, and we've proved this, you certainly have, that this business of you can move around, be anywhere, spend your resources on traveling around the place, finding interesting books you want to do in any language. And as a globalized citizen, you could be based in Paris or Jumhuriyat Alaiya or wherever. You should be able to do it as long as you provide a reasonably courteous distribution to your authors. You are able to pay them and their translators on time. Then it should be possible to do. Now, this was not a view necessarily shared by the rest of the world, because traditionally, as you know, we've always been told by the publishers out there, either when we're dealing with American publishers or UK publishers, that traditionally your role is that you buy for your territory. So you buy for India, at best you buy for South Asia, whatever. But they can cherry pick what they want from you, and we need to sell those rights for the rest of the world, put their name on it, do it with arrangement with you. So the traditional roles were pretty set and defined for decades. So we were breaking this model. So each time we would go to, say, a big German publisher or a French publisher, in the beginning there was a gentle kind of resistance, not a major thing, where they would say, okay, so you're publishing Arthur for Calcutta. I said, no, we're publishing for the world. And that was the other thing. We insisted that we would not buy for UK or USA or India, we would buy for the world. Now, this model is about 300 books old since 2005 and 6. We're distributed by the University of Chicago Press. But you're actually hands-on producing everything in Calcutta. You ship it to their warehouse in different parts of the world. And publishers across the world, particularly in Europe, are now seeing you as a tiny, very, very, very tiny ray of hope. The fact that you're actually bringing back a certain kind of European translation into English language bookshelves, because it had stopped. It had stopped when the Pelican stopped. It had stopped when the sort of Rupas of old used to start bringing in all this wonderful literature. And when publishing did become a sort of accountant, number crunching game. But I think it's only possible in today's world, where the digital is not necessarily a threat, but the bigger conglomerates do tend to be disappearing into the arms of the digital, whereas you and I as independents have to craft and design and do more and more boutique books where you texture and feel is wonderful. I personally don't feel the threat of the digital. One does it parallelly, but one doesn't give up the print.
Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily a threat. It's just another another area in which to move. Actually, this is a very interesting thing, but before we carry on with this, I want to go back actually to talking a little bit more about Tagore and Moyan as writers and their politics. As you know, Moyan, because he has chosen to live on in India and live on in China, I'm sorry, live on in China and write from within China, has often been accused of being a sympathizer to the powers that be, and often been accused of not being overtly political and not speaking out on behalf of other Chinese writers who have been, for example, imprisoned, or for example, Cao Xingjiang, who also won the Nobel, but who won it as a French citizen, not as a Chinese citizen, and his books continue to be banned in China. Now, Tagore's, as you pointed out also, Tagore's politics were very clear, very strong, and he wasn't an apolitical person at all. But what would you say about this kind of criticism? Where does it place the writer who might have some very difficult choices to make about writing from, let's say, I imagine that for Moyan it would be very important to be located somewhere where the village from which he gets the sustenance for his writing, the hard life and loneliness that in fact he talks about being his fortune and that informs his writing, to be located somewhere close to that, and perhaps to develop a politics which is much more insidious, much more subtle than the outward kind of political stance.
Sure.
What's your sense of this?
Absolutely. This is
not only in relation to him, but writers and their politics generally.
Sure, sure. No, I think this is a question that comes up often, right? Which is that I think for people like Moyan, or for that matter an Eisenstein or a Tarkovsky in the old days, is when you're in regimes where you have to subvert things from within and keep a kind of balance between you as a political being, but not you necessarily as a street fighter or a self-immolator or a, you know, all of which has a place in the politics of us as human beings. There are actions that move us into taking certain kinds of stances. But there are people like him who, certainly in all of his books, there are interesting ways in which he is actually taking on the politics of contemporary China in an interesting way, highlighting, working his way, commenting, being ironic, being cynical. A writer doesn't necessarily have to be a street fighter in that sense. I'm sort of using that as a kind of loose term to differentiate between a kind of intellectually very alive, taking a stance, writing a certain way, as against somebody who takes up arms literally and decides to be up there in the barricades. Often they fuse, they mix, often one starts life as one and becomes, you know, we don't know. I mean, this man is capable of, we don't know what compulsions he's under. I think that to be able to, as you said, survive in an environment that creates his writing, that sort of gives him that
sustenance,
the sustenance of it, the nurturing of it. He is, you know, I mean, he's doing it on his own terms, and he is walking a tightrope. I don't think he is short charging either those of us who read him or himself as a political being. I don't think he's chickening out of that. So, I mean, it's, I mean, a interesting example would be, and this was something when we were discussing things earlier, you were talking about the recent Naipaul thing.
Yeah, the recent discussion on Naipaul. In fact, I was reading a piece in the papers, an editorial piece by Pratap Bhanu Mehta, which talks about the debate about between, well, what Girish Karnad said about Naipaul and the response that there has been about Naipaul's politics. And the article makes the point that sometimes it is wrong to confuse a writer's politics with his writing. And sometimes the writer needs to have a distant stance. And maybe it is the, I don't know what the word is, the dislikability of the political stances that he or she might take that allows them to gain insights which otherwise would not have been so sharp and so disturbing. So that Naipaul and his politics should, you know, it should not, Naipaul's politics and his writing should not necessarily be confused that he's got the wrong politics, therefore he's a terrible writer. But maybe it is just that distance that politics gives him that allows him to become the writer that he is. I think it's actually quite an interesting thing. I hadn't thought of it that way till I read this piece.
Yeah, no, I also worry about our ability to be very dismissive very quickly. If a particular writer says or writes in a public space and takes a particular stance which to the, you know, a certain kind of majority seems like a anti-something and not correct politically with either ours or the politics of that person in their nation, we tend to condemn very quickly. We also tend to label it as a, this is it, there is no turning back from this, there's no either evolving or going sideways, or that it may, he or she at that particular moment may have actually vomited out that particular thought or statement, the kind of thought process that went into it, the fallout from there leading to a completely different kind of person saying different kinds of things. It's not an easy one. You cannot, you know,
cannot separate,
yeah, and
like
especially
that.
somebody like Moyan, if you're going back to the kind of writing he's doing, you know, I mean, to me, it's very interesting because he is a kind of person whose writing goes back and forth and sideways, up and down all the time. You sort of, you can't pinpoint.
He's developing, you're saying, all
It's
the time.
not a kind of predictable genre. It's not so simple.
Which is what makes it so interesting. Naveen, I want to get back to the point we were discussing about publishing just briefly. You know, I was recently in Sharjah at the Sharjah Book Fair, where they had gathered together publishers from all over the world to talk about Arab writing, really, and to bring Arab writing to the attention of the international world. And one of the interesting things there was, it was amazing to see how the entire thing was so dominated still by American and British publishers. Now here you are trying to do something different, trying to change that equation. There's still a long way to go. So do you think there's really a chance of making a dent, briefly?
I think the dent is being made. The change is happening. When we started in 2006 to now, there is more and more publisher in Europe wanting options to the American British model.
Do you think that will work?
Absolutely.
So as they say in our culture, tumhare muh mein ghee shakkar, let's hope it works out.
Yes.
And it would be great if we can begin to change that. You know? Thank you very much, Naveen.
Thank you, Urvashi.